Well, thank you very much, Linda. And as Linda mentioned, I'm a wildlife biologist. I have a master's degree in wildlife management. And the subject of today's talk is dominionism, wild horses, and our relationship to nature. And what I'm going to try and do with this talk is move us backward to the very beginning, the very root of the problem. What is going wrong? What is at the root of the wild horse problem? And it turns out that what is at the root of the wild horse problem is also at the root of just about every other environmental problem on the planet. And I want to talk us through that because as a person with a master's degree in wildlife management, I am a master of dominionism. I am indoctrinated fully in dominionism, and I have been raised from babies intellectually to believe that this idea of dominionism. So let's find out what it all means. It all starts with a Christian Bible. And in the beginning of the Word was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And that was the beginning, right? But that's the New Testament. In the Old Testament, what it begins with is the book of Genesis. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. Have dominion. Be in charge. You're the boss of nature. This is where it all comes from. It is a religious belief. It comes from the very beginning, and it's rooted in our entire culture. But that wasn't the beginning of humanity's story, because we all started as hunters and gatherers. And in that relationship, we were one species among many. We were a predatory and an herbivorous and an omnivorous species on the landscape together with hundreds of thousands of other species, living in a dynamic balance with nature. And that happened even up to the present day. We have hunter-gatherers who live a subsistence lifestyle and live in a dynamic balance with nature as a part of the ecosystems instead of being apart from the ecosystem. And then came the Neolithic Revolution, where we decided that we were going to cultivate crops, we were going to domesticate animals. This is where we came to the point where we needed to own land, we needed to have governments, we needed to have wars over property. This is really the root of both human civilization and everything that is wrong with human civilization. It comes from the agricultural revolution during the Neolithic period about 10,000 years ago. And remember that the Christian Bible is very much a product of agricultural society. This is an agrarian religious doctrine. This is all, if you read through the Bible, it's the flock, the shepherd, all of the similes and metaphors in the Bible touch toward agricultural principles because it is an agricultural religion. And when we came to the formation of the North American continent, the doctrine of discovery was the fundamental legal basis for white colonization of the Americas. And the doctrine of discovery basically said to the Christian kings and queens and monarchs of the European nations, whoever goes forth and plants their flag on an area that doesn't have any Christian nation claim to it can have a claim to it. And it's rooted, that doctrine of discovery is rooted in a papal bull, the papal bull Inter Cetera, with this proviso, however, that none of the islands and mainlands found and to be found, discovered and to be discovered, beyond that said line towards the west and south, be in the actual possession of any Christian king or prince up to the birthday of our Lord Jesus Christ just passed, from which the present year 1493 begins, and we make a point and depute you and your said heirs and successors, lords of them, with full and free power, authority, and jurisdiction of every kind. With this proviso, however, that by this our gift, grant, and assignment, no right acquired by any Christian prince who may be in actual possession of said islands and mainlands prior to the said birthday of our Lord Jesus Christ is hereby to be understood to be withdrawn or taken away. So what this means, this is a lot of flowery language from the Pope Alexander VI in 1493. But what this says is that indigenous people have no right to hold land. Only the Christian princes and kings have the right to hold land. And so by discovering new, quote unquote, uninhabited lands, and uninhabited is defined as not having Christian people, then the European kings and princes get to claim that land and bring it into their empire. And this is the foundational doctrine that started the colonization of North America. It is a religious doctrine. And so on this continent, we brought forth a nation that is founded on religious principles by the Pope. And then as the colonies decided that they wanted to expand the United States project beyond the original 13 colonies, there was this philosophy called Manifest Destiny, and this was actually coined by a newspaper editor by the name of John O'Sullivan in 1845, who said it is our country's, quote, manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. Manifest destiny. We have a manifest destiny as a nation to spread all the way to the Pacific coast. And once this phrase was coined, every president thereafter throughout the 1800s went forth and touched upon that phrase as an imperative for American expansionism across the West. Now this is a very famous painting by a painter by the name of John Gass in 1872 called American Progress. And I want you to take a look at what you see in this painting. You see the Native Americans fleeing before and being depopulated from the West. This is basically ethnic cleansing that is being celebrated in this painting. You see the bison being chased off of the plains. You see the wolves and the bears being chased away. The wilderness is being tamed. Civilization, quote unquote, which is defined as Western European American civilization, is being spread throughout the West. And as it's being spread throughout the West, all of the wildness and the self-willed nature is being extinguished in order to make room for what is called American progress. So cultural genocide is American progress. Ecological destruction, American progress. And the ultimate goal here is to make the land productive. Productive for what? For profits. Now, if you look at these crop fields, this is a glowing vision of what productivity of the land is supposed to look like. But from an ecological perspective, this is an ecological desert. This is ecological failure. This is a biodiversity crisis that's happening because this is single and few crop monoculture. And nothing that is native can survive in this area. And then when you add herbicides and pesticides on top of that, then you have basically the extinction of everything that is not of commercial value. And that is the ultimate expression of dominionism in the West and every other part of North America. But there was a different vision too at the same time. This is a painting by Albert Bierstadt called Along the Sierra Nevada from 1868. And there were those Americans who thought wildness and spectacular beauty and the West's great magnificent landscapes have values of their own. And these values are perhaps greater than making all lands productive. And rooted in these visions in the 1800s from people like Albert Bierstadt, from people like John Muir, who, although he had issues with being racist, as did most people of the 1800s, let's be frank, had some visionary ideas that maybe we shouldn't make every single centimeter of the American West into a fully productive agricultural landscape. Let's have something called preservation or conservation. And so out of this movement came national parks. Out of this movement came the United States Forest Service. Out of this movement came the Bureau of Land Management from the leftovers of what was left over when the homesteaders had taken what they wanted. And still at this same time, despite the American progress that was out there, we did have indigenous tribes fully inhabiting this landscape, fully living together with all the native ecosystems that were out there, that were living in a dynamic balance with the ecosystems that were there. Now that we have reached the 21st century, we look back upon this time and say, well, which vision was really the civilized vision? And we're learning as we eat everything that maybe our Euro-American vision wasn't the most civilized vision of all the options available. But as you look into what was fueling this expansion of the West and the taming of the West and the agricultural domination of the West, it was Western boosterism. It was this old Chamber of Commerce business lobby movement that coined phrases like "Go West, young man," and "Rain will follow the plow." This endless optimism that all we have to do is go and claim this land and clear it and make it productive, because before it was a waste. Before it was a desert. Before it had no use or value. And we can only reclaim it and make it valuable through agricultural taming of it and domestication of it. But even at this time, there were those who had other views. Zebulon Pike in the 1830s crossed the plains, and he declared that everything west of the 100th meridian, the 100th meridian goes through the middle of Nebraska, everything west of the 100th meridian is the great American desert, not suited to agriculture. This is a photograph of John Wesley Powell, who was the first white explorer to float the Grand Canyon in 1869. He led surveys of the West for the U.S. Geological Survey during the 1870s. He became the second head of the U.S. Geological Survey, but he got in big trouble because you know what he did? He told Congress that most of the West should never be irrigated or farmed because it's too dry. And in 1894, under pressure from Congress, he was basically going to get sacked, so he resigned because the Congress had cut the funding for the USGS and canceled his irrigation report that found that you couldn't irrigate out in the desert. There just wasn't enough water. And guess what? He was wrong in the near term. And we went forth and we farmed it. And we went forth and we irrigated it. But here in 2026, the Salt Lake is getting dewatered because we're irrigating too much, and the lake level is dropping, and the winds are blowing arsenic from a century of toxic waste flowing into the lake. The Colorado River doesn't have enough water to fill up Lake Powell and Lake Mead, causing possible dam failure. Those chickens are coming home to roost, and it's because John Wesley Powell in the long run was right. This is a great American desert. This is an area that is really fairly unsuitable for agriculture. And then as we move through into the more modern times, this is a photograph from 1887 of some cowboys roping a wolf. And of course, we all know that the livestock industry was largely responsible for driving wolves extinct. And that was part of dominionism as well. It is the idea that everything that is part of the howling wilderness must be tamed, and what cannot be tamed must be killed and eliminated and pushed away. And wolves were part of that, and coyotes were part of that. And when you think about the talking points that you hear sometimes from the anti-wild horse lobby, that there aren't any natural predators for wild horses. This is why. It is their fault. They killed them all. And they're trying to kill them all today. And they have even got a death squad, a federally funded USDA Wildlife Services that exists solely to kill animals that are inconvenient to farming and ranching. And livestock interests can make a call to USDA Wildlife Services and say, I have too many coyotes. Wolves are killing my cattle. Grizzly bears are killing my domestic sheep. And they will come out and they will do aerial gunning, they will do trapping, they will do all kinds of different wildlife killing activities. And in recent years, over 375,000 individual animals have been killed each year by USDA Wildlife Services. These are native species. This does not count the non-native species that they also kill. These are the native wildlife that are being killed. And you, the taxpayer, are paying for this to get rid of the wildlife on our public lands and on private land as well. Now, M44 cyanide bombs, if you don't know about them, they're chemical landmines. They're armed with cyanide. This little gentleman in the lower left is named Kenyon Mansfield. He was poisoned, almost killed by one of these that was planted on BLM lands behind his home. His dog was killed. USDA Wildlife Services, thanks to a WWP petition, ceased the use of M44s in Idaho, but in many states it continues. And this is part of the death, and this is part of dominionism. We have the right to plant chemical weapons out on public lands to kill native wildlife to make sure that we are in control. The idea that there is trapping. First, the fur trade was one of the earliest things that came west, and the idea was we can monetize the native wildlife. This is a USDA Wildlife Services photo of a trapping of a coyote and harassment of that coyote by a domestic dog. This agent got in big trouble for this, but he was spreading it around the internet on his own personal Facebook account, if you can believe that. But this idea that we should go forth and trap individual animals so that they are, eliminated from the landscape for the benefit of the livestock industry, this is part of the domestication of the land. This is dominionism. This is we are in charge. We have new Trump administration sage-grouse plan amendments that strike down all of the protections that existed before for sage-grouse habitat. Now, why would we want to do that? Because the livestock industry, the oil industry, the mining industry want to have control. And habitat was getting in the way of the full exploitation of these economic resources on public lands. Therefore, we must sweep aside the conservation and make way for ever more commercial exploitation. And who was the first entity to jump on the bandwagon once these plans were released? It was the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, our old friends, coming out and saying, these revised sage-grouse plans recognize the role of cattle producers as the original conservationists. The revised sage-grouse management plans will support the work of ranchers. These plans, the license revenue that was going to fund the State Department of Wildlife Conservation. It was all about hunter output, angler output, commodity output. If you were a species that wasn't hunted or fished for, you didn't get any attention, you didn't get any conservation, you didn't get any funding, you didn't get any studies. And that's fueling the biodiversity crisis that's happening all across the West as well, because these state-level wildlife agencies are only paying any attention to game and fish that are commodities. And that underlies this entire North American model for wildlife management, the commodification of wildlife. And it's because we see wildlife as something that should also be under human dominion. You hear it all the time. The wolves need to be managed. The elk need to be managed. Well, what happened before the wildlife managers showed up in 1491? Gosh, all those wildlife must have been extinct if they all need us to manage them. Well, nature does a lot better job of managing than we do. And I'm here to tell you as a biologist, we know about this much of what is to be known, and about this much is still to be discovered. So we're kind of like, if you had your dentist go and work on an IndyCar engine. He might be very good at dentistry, but he might not be a very good auto engine mechanic. And he might know a few things, but maybe not enough to tune that IndyCar engine. That's where we're at. And yet we're telling everybody, as biologists, oh, we got this. We got science. It's all science. Listen to us, we're the experts. But we're not acknowledging how little we really do know. One of the new ideas that is out there is that we are moving into the Anthropocene epoch, that we are leaving what is geologically considered the Holocene epoch and moving into a new era in which humanity dominates everything. This is the ultimate expression of dominionism, and it was originally brought forward by geologists whose idea was, well, if you look at the geologic strata starting about the middle of the 1900s, everything you see is full of plastic. That's the geologic strata. That's what you see. The geologic signature for this era is plastic. And so, they had this idea that this is the Anthropocene, and along with it, there were conservationists that were then seeing this as an opportunity to have a new kind of conservation. And this is something that was from 2012 by Peter Kareva, who was working for the Nature Conservancy, and Michel Marvier, who said, instead of trying to restore remote, iconic landscapes of pre-European conditions, conservation will measure its achievement in large part by its relevance to people. including some of the city dwellers. Nature could be a garden, not a carefully manicured and rigid one, but a tangle of species and wilderness amongst lands used for food production, mineral extraction, and urban life. In other words, the earth is there for us to use and manage, and we should be gardeners of nature. We shouldn't have wild, self-willed nature. We should have human manipulated nature. This is an idea that is now gaining currency and gaining political support in all kinds of different areas, and it is an ultimate expression of this dominionism philosophy. And I think there are a lot of folks out there that would like us to believe that we should just give up on the old idea of having wild nature, of having wilderness, of having natural areas, and instead have kind of these Anthropocene-dominated landscapes. And another phenomenon that you see a lot lately is this idea of working landscapes. Well, what are working landscapes? Well, the idea is that a landscape needs to work. And who's the landscape working for? Human profit, us. The landscape works for us. And so when we talk about working landscapes, we're talking about the areas between cities or towns and natural areas with limited continuous use by people. Rural areas, which often are dominated by intensive or extensive agricultural, forestry, or other natural resource-based economies, are generally a part of a working landscape. So when somebody says working landscape, what they mean is agriculture, logging, mining, drilling, extraction. That's what working landscape means. Folks that are promoting this idea are trying to say, look at the pictures that they use. Oh, it's a beautiful picture with flowers and natural landscape. No, this is not what they want. They want profits. They want profits. That's at the root of all of this. Now let's circle around to wild horses. And as we've heard earlier today, wild horses are a symbol of freedom. A symbol of freedom. They're living wild and free, living their best lives out on public lands, largely unconstrained. If you think about that from an agricultural perspective, that is both offensive and threatening. Okay? If you are an agricultural person and you have been raised all your life to believe that these are domestic animals that have to be protected from the elements, that have to be protected from predators, that need to be managed, they are domestic animals, then the idea that these animals might be living their best life out in the wild is a direct indictment of everything that you have been taught your entire life, stretching back for 5 generations. And indeed, when the opponents of wild horses say, and they have said so to me, you have to call them feral horses. You can't call them wild horses. They're non-native invasive species. You have to call them feral horses. What are they doing? They are denigrating the wild horse. They are putting the wild horse down below the level of the domestic horse so they can once again reassert the idea that only by domestication do we have the best use of the animal. And the animal is only maximized by using the animal. I don't want to overreach too far here, but isn't that what the slave owners said on the cotton plantations in the 1830s? Yeah, these slaves, we give them a purpose, we teach them a trade, we give them a roof over their head, they're better off. That's what some of the cotton plantation owners said. It's a little bit similar. And when you look at the roundups that we have of these wild horses, these helicopter roundups, isn't that an agricultural term? Isn't that human management, human domination? Isn't that the opposite of wildness? And when you load these wild horses onto cattle trailers and haul them away to feedlots, isn't that agricultural at its root? This is dominionism too. This is us being in control of the wild horse. And when they end up, and this is the Rock Springs Corral, this is the holding corral after the Great Divide Roundup of, I think it was 2020. Maybe it was 2021. Are these wild horses anymore? Once they have been castrated for the males, once they have been broken up from their natural family bonds. Now they're going to be auctioned off and sold like livestock because they have now become livestock. The ultimate transformation of the wild horse into the agricultural setting. And then if they go to long-term holding, and I want to acknowledge that some of them don't, some of them get siphoned into the slaughter pipeline, and that's a real phenomenon, that's a major problem. But many of them go into the long-term holding, and we now have more wild horses, former wild horses in long-term holding than we have wild horses out on the range. There are more. And where are they? These long-term holding facilities, 92% of them are in Kansas, Oklahoma, and other eastern plains states east of the 100th meridian. They're not in the Great American Desert anymore. And so we are taking horses off of desert landscapes where they are thriving. We are transporting them at huge monetary cost with roundups and transport. We are now renting pastures in the most productive cattle pasture areas in North America. And we're kicking cattle off of these pastures so we can have wild horses out here. These are the areas that are most productive for cattle. These are the areas where cattle ought to be produced if you believe that there ought to be cattle. This is where they should be. Yet we're kicking them off. And why are we doing it? So we can have more cattle out on western public lands where they're being charged $1.69 an animal unit month compared to the $25 to $30 they would charge for the same private rangeland for renting. And we're doing it at a cost to the taxpayer of $70 an animal unit month to house the wild horses for the rest of their lives on these pastures in eastern Oklahoma and eastern Kansas. That can be around $50,000 per individual horse. Why are we paying so much taxpayer money to do this when the horses were doing just fine out in the arid lands of the West? So, kind of in sum, why do we do this? We do this because we are taking away horses and offering up the livestock industry the cheapest forage anywhere in America. We are propping up cattle operations in the arid part of North America where they have to be subsidized for a portion of the year, whether that's the dry portion of the year or the cold portion of the year, with hay crops. And this is a huge fiscal scandal, really. I mean, it's crazy that we're doing this. And it makes no sense from a policy standpoint. It makes no sense from a conservation standpoint. It makes no sense from an animal welfare standpoint. It makes no sense from a fiscal standpoint. I haven't heard of epizootic hemorrhagic disease.
There you got it.
And I'd like to learn more, so please send me what you have on it. But it sounds more like Ebola than it does like chronic wasting disease, because chronic wasting disease is a prion disease that eats your brain, turning it into Swiss cheese, and then you gradually lose your function. First your cognitive skills, then your motor skills. You walk around as a dying deer, and it is universally fatal, drooling until you're either picked off by a predator or you die, and it's highly contagious. And oh, by the way, they have fed chronic wasting disease infected meat to monkeys in Canada, and the monkeys came down with it. So I, as a hunter, am here to tell you that if you're eating an animal that is infected with chronic wasting disease, you are at severe risk for getting those prions. And I suspect, and I've had other biological researchers bring this idea to me, that in fact many of the cases that are being diagnosed as Alzheimer's today are actually CWD, but we're not slicing open the brains and testing for prions for those cadavers.
Thank you.
Yeah, another point on that isn't that mountain lions, which the whole Dominion industry wants to exterminate, are really needed to hunt the elk because they stop the cycle of the chronic wasting disease, and it's one of the only ways it gets stopped. And then the other question is, what do you think about the call we had at the beginning to just boycott beef.
Yes.
Just boycott it.
Well, I mean, starting with the last question first, I think Scott's suggestion that if you're going to eat beef, you should buy it from a local, known producer whom you can get to know and get to understand their operation, and that it is sustainable on the environment, and it is, animal welfare standards are being upheld. I think that's good advice. I think that's really sound advice. And I think people should be doing that. I'm not going to get into the question of whether you should eat beef or be vegan or anything like that. But if we all eat less of the beef that is causing the most of the problems, we're all helping. So I would say for everybody in the room, regardless of your choices can make a difference on that front. And then to your second point, by eliminating the native carnivores, yes, the predators are the best agents to cut the sickness from the herd. And we have scientific studies now that have critically tested the hypothesis and found it to be true. And the studies that are most on point is there's one in, I think, 2016 on mountain lions and hunting on chronic wasting disease from Colorado. And they found that the mountain lions differentially selected the animals that had chronic wasting disease. And oh, by the way, for whatever reason, these large carnivores don't seem to get these prions. I don't know why that is, because us primates can clearly get them. But they don't seem to, and they don't pass them through in their scat. So they can cleanse the landscape of chronic wasting disease because they can recognize they're preying upon the weak and the sick first because they're the easiest. And why wouldn't you take the easiest meal? Of course you would. And yet with human hunting, we're not here to take the easiest meal, we're here to take the largest trophy. So that's a different set of priorities, right? And if you're a hunter and you see an animal that's logy and drooling and you think it might have chronic wasting disease because you're a really educated hunter, that is the last deer that you're going to take. Because then you're going to take that head in to the local veterinarian, and that veterinarian is going to test it for CWD, and it's going to have it, and you're not going to be able to eat that meat. And everybody should be testing for that, by the way, if you're hunting elk or deer, because the chronic wasting disease is pretty much spreading everywhere in the West by now.
It's all the way in Maryland and Virginia now too.
Yeah, so in regards to one of your earlier points about some of the wildlife corridors and habitat conservation things that can potentially help reconnect environments and allow them to adapt to some of the issues that we're talking about, are you familiar with a bill, HR 8438, that has recently been introduced?
Is that the Wildlife Corridors and Conservation
Sure
Act?
is, yes. Do you have opinions on that? Is it something we should be calling it out and supporting, or is it something disguised as pretty, language that we don't want to be going anywhere?
Well, let me put your fears to rest.
Okay.
I am the originator of that concept. That concept first debuted at a meeting that I had with the Deputy Interior Secretary of Lands and Minerals. And I went together with somebody from the Wildlands Project to that meeting to propose the idea of national wildlife corridors to be designated. And through secretarial withdrawal, and the Secretary of Interior has the ability to withdraw lands from certain kinds of use and development. And so I proposed this to the Secretary of Interior. Well, that went nowhere. This was during the Obama administration. But the Rewilding Institute person that I was there with took it to Representative Beyer. And then Representative Beyer started cooking up legislation. He sent it my way to look at, and I was able to have my input. And yes, it's a little more watered down than what I would have originally proposed, but it's still a good thing.
Yeah. So how do we support it? Let us know what we should be doing.
I think, if you want to call your Congress people and start with the House, because Congressman Beyer's on the House side, and tell them support the Wildlife Corridors and Conservation Act, then that is a way to get national migration corridors designated. Now, for wild horses, there is a second layer to the corridor question that everybody here should be paying attention to, which is your wild horse herd connected to other wild horse herds, or is it isolated? And that becomes a critical biological question. The reason of which is that if your horse herd is isolated, and it is less than 278 total animals, if it's not being treated with birth control. 278 would be the number. That's the threshold. That is the minimum viable population for genetic viability. If you drop below that number, you start losing your genetic diversity. You start having inbreeding depression, which is loss of fertility. You start having a higher level of birth defects, things like clubfoot perhaps, or blindness. These are preventable things that are prevented from having an abundant genetic diversity. When you have an isolated population and the Bureau of Land Management cuts it down to 100 animals, or 50 animals, or 25 animals, they are creating a genetic bottleneck in which their remaining genetic information is limited to those 25 or 50 or 100 animals that were there. You're losing some of the important genetic information from the herd. You can never get it back. It's like extinction. You can't get it back unless you truck in horses from somewhere else and play God, and that's dominionism, right? So the way that you want to solve this is you want to reconnect the wild horse herds. They were originally, at the time of Lewis and Clark, they were all connected. So that should be a priority. And to make sure that all the herds, at minimum, if they're isolated, are being managed at 278 animals or larger.
Can you repeat the numbers for the bill?
HR 8438.
Who did that research on the genetic viability?
The research on the genetic viability,
The one you were just kind of, who
it
was
is, okay, here are the researchers that you need to know. It's, I think is it Frankum? I think it's Frankum 2014. That is, effective number needs to be 101,000, or 100 individuals need to be effective number. Now, to figure out how many wild horses it takes to get an effective population of 100, and an effective population is, according to the definition, how many horses you need to have the equivalent of having 100 active breeders that are equally male and female. We all know that horses are not equally male and female when they breed, because one stallion breeds many mares, so it's skewed. So it's less than the 200. You don't get every animal to be an effective population. You have to have a cheat factor. And it is Singer et al., 2000, I think it was, the study from the wild horse herd in southeastern Montana, the Pryor Mountain wild horse herd.
Fires.
Yeah, and Singer et al. Gave the calculation for wild horses on effective number. And so when you combine those two figures, the number that you get is 278. The folks that are in this room may be familiar with Gus Cothran. Gus Cothran quotes a lower number, usually around 150. I have asked this question and had it answered to my satisfaction that Gus Cothran was using the old 5,500 rule from the 1980s, before the 100-1,000 rule supplanted it. So that's old information. That's old information. Science has moved on, and we have better resolution now in our numbers. Do we have time for one more? I don't know how we're doing.
Yeah, we can do one more.
Go ahead. Back in the middle.
How small is the Anthropocene perspective in our universities and among other biologists? I've never heard of it.
I think right now it is largely an academic, kind of argument. But these academic arguments have a tendency to get latched onto and grabbed onto. And the one slide that I gave you, the guy that was advancing this Anthropocene was in the Nature Conservancy. So they're already moving into the lands and wildlife conservation sphere with this. And there are those of us who are saying, no, we shouldn't have humanity as the ultimate gardener, trimming and fertilizing and repotting everything in the universe. We should have nature exist on a self-willed, wild basis. And there are others who are saying, no, that's all so last century. Let's just give up on that. That's a pipe dream. And that's a big battle within conservation right now. And there are two movements right now that are battling for control. And one of the movements is led by the Wilderness Society. It's called Ground Shift. And Ground Shift, it was rolled out a couple of weeks ago by Tracy Stone Manning and others, whom you may know. And the idea was they brought in some George W. Bush appointees who were lobbyists for the timber industry and other folks who were anti-conservation by any measure that you want. But their idea is, well, let's all collaborate and let's come up with something that everybody can agree with. And once all of human society agrees on what nature should happen, then nature should just live with our decision, right? Once again, dominionism. And then there's another school of thought called the New Direction for Public Lands, which WWP and the John Muir Project are spearheading, in which we are working to have an alternate vision for nature and reinvigorate the environmental movement with more protections, more natural control, more progress in conservation instead of just giving up and conceding 2/3 of the loaf to the other side. And with that, I'll surrender the mic. Thank you.